Hi everyone, great to be here today. My name's Liz Harrowell. I'm an Associate Director in KPMG's Climate Risk and Strategy team. I sit within our ESG services team and work with my clients specifically on helping them understand the impacts of climate change on their business and helping them to develop strategies to help them respond. A big part of my job is decarbonisation strategies today. The reason my team focuses specifically on climate risk is that there's significant global momentum, I'm sure many of you are already aware of this, behind the climate agenda today. And what we're seeing is companies take a much more proactive, what we're calling a strategic risk management approach to climate change. This type of thinking has also been the focus of new and emerging regulations being introduced in the UK. And I've been helping companies disclose climate risk under guidance like the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures and incoming BEI's climate risk disclosure roles. Many of the companies I'm working with are also facing quite significant pressure from their investors, their customers, employees, and other stakeholder groups to more actively manage their climate impact. And at the same time, what we're seeing is the market and regulations are really rapidly expanding to other material ESG issues beyond climate change. Groups like the International Sustainability Standards Board and the EU's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive are really pushing companies towards more integrated consideration of sustainability and financial performance. So while a lot of my talk speaks today about climate, I'll also be sharing some insights on other related impacts as well. We're seeing a lot of consideration being made to broader sustainability issues like nature and biodiversity, the circular economy, and social impacts of climate change on the way that we operate today. I'll just move on to my first slide. I think today we're at an inflection in terms of where we're at with the climate agenda. We've seen really significant momentum in the last 18 months with countries racing to set net zero targets. Today, 88% of countries are covered by, and I should say global emissions are covered by net zero targets, but the way this is translated so far into current policies and action by governments is a far cry away from net zero. What this opens up is quite significant uncertainty in terms of the future of climate change and how this is likely to evolve in future. And that is really exposing a lot of businesses to different risks and opportunities in responding to the climate agenda. I'm often asked in my job, where do I think the world is going? What direction are we moving? And what will the future look like? And I think it's a very challenging question given just how much change we've seen in recent months. In saying that, I think there are some promising trends that I'll talk to on the next slide that are pushing us towards a net zero future. What we're seeing in a number of global surveys is that consumers are starting to say they're factoring in sustainability into their purchasing decisions. Perhaps more prominent in certain markets, in certain demographics, although what we do believe is that a systemic change will be needed to get us to net zero in the way that consumers behave from now into the future. So who are the types of stakeholders that are driving this change? From our customers, they're starting to see growth in the market for greener travel and tourism options, green product labelling in the food and beverage industry, and customers switching to greener modes of travel. I mentioned the regulations and users of company reports at the start of this. There's significant growth in the regulatory environment that, as I said before, is pushing towards that more holistic consideration of sustainability. We look at climate change as a systemic issue, which in a similar way to, I think, what the pandemic has highlighted over the last few years, really highlights the interconnectivity between ESG issues and the financial impacts on the companies and the sectors that we operate in. Similarly, investors are looking at how they can align their portfolios with their own sustainability and climate goals, how they can incentivise change for good, and how they can create new business opportunities from the green agenda. For example, green bonds, or incentivising and intervening to create the right decarbonisation behaviours that are aligned with their own climate goals. And lastly, other businesses. Businesses are recognising the reputational impact of good sustainability practices. Of course, industry networks like this one are critical to building this across the sector and driving change across the industry and the value chains that we operate in to help really realise this value in the future. So the first part I mentioned at my introduction was the work that I do to help companies understand what does all of this mean, particularly for sectors where there's less direct exposure today, but where that potential systemic change of the future could really shift the ways that we live, work and travel. So this slide here sets out some of the common themes that we're seeing our clients speak about today. I've broken that down into climate-related impacts and broader sustainability issues, and I will just give some examples of each of these. So firstly, to the climate impacts. On my slide here, I have 5 major themes we talk about that when looking at potential climate-related impacts in the hospitality sector. Firstly, changing travel patterns, and to some extent have already seen this in the pandemic with a shift towards hybrid and remote working. The second area is really looking at changing customer expectations from both business and leisure consumers. So similar to this theme, today over 70% of the world's leading businesses have set decarbonisation targets. Leading authorities in target setting, like the Science Based Target Initiative, are allowing companies to set Scope 3 emissions reduction targets, which rely on not only their own, but their business partners and their value chains to decarbonise. And more broadly, what we're seeing in the B2B sector is looking for greener hospitality services to help our customers meet their own emissions reduction commitments around Scope 3 emissions and support their decarbonisation goals in partnership with their key business partners. But this isn't isolated to business alone, and there's a growing number of leisure travellers who are increasingly factoring in environmental performance into how and where they spend their leisure time. At the same time, in the customer expectations, we're seeing more frequent searches for green products and a rise in green and eco-labelling. Depending on how individual companies respond, developing green credentials can be an opportunity to gain market share and more actively manage and promote sustainability performance of the organisations we're working with. The third element here touches on policy changes, things like green building standards, carbon and environmental policy costs, and the impacts of changes to carbon taxes, which are linking government emissions reduction targets more directly to the way that we operate our businesses today. Energy consumption and emissions performance, of course, very critical to all of this, and I won't talk too much about this. I know we'll speak about this more today, but I'll come on to the ways that we're seeing companies start to manage their energy and emissions performance across their value chains. And lastly, we speak about physical risk. We break this down into 2 risk categories: those acute risks like flooding and wildfires that can cause immediate and severe physical damage, as well as longer-term trends like droughts and rising temperatures that could impact not only the hospitality industry directly, but also the supply chains you source goods and services from in the future. In the second category, those broader sustainability trends, I'll just pick out a few today that we're really seeing a lot of focus on. But to start with nature and biodiversity, I think if climate is sort of the first cab off the rank in sustainability terms, the way that companies are considering nature and biodiversity risk may be the second. There's a new framework being developed called the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, the TNFD, which is going to ask companies to consider nature risk in a very similar way to how climate is being considered today. And we expect this to be integrated ultimately into regulation in a similar way in the coming years. With my clients, we're seeing a lot of activity, particularly in the financial services industry in this topic, where our clients are looking to understand that portfolio level risk around nature, and that's really going to start shaping the way they engage with the companies they invest in. In future, we're expecting to see that this will also shape the way that the other companies are responding and looking at nature risk from that portfolio level as well. One other key trend I'll talk about is packaging in the circular economy. So regulation and legislation around packaging is expected to get stricter, both in terms of the price per tonne and the expected recycled content base for things like plastic taxes. Policies around harmful chemicals in plastics are globally on the horizon, though it's not yet clear how the UK will approach forever chemicals in plastics today. Though what we will see is increased collaboration across the value chain, which is going to be essential as government looks to drive towards a more circular economy in the UK. And some of our clients are starting to think already about how single-use plastics will affect their business and whether they should be looking to adopt more reuse and refill business models. On my slide as well, I've got more broadly supply chain engagement, which I think is critical to managing both climate and other sustainability issues. We're lastly seeing quite a big focus in what's known as the just transition, looking at the socio-economic impacts of this shift in climate and the climate transition and what that will mean in a broader ESG sense. While the just transition itself has been focused initially on more energy-intensive industries, we're starting to see governments and companies looking at how that social shift will impact what that means for the workforce and adjacent industries in terms of the social implications around shifting towards net zero. So this takes me back to climate, and what I have here on the slide is at the bottom, just setting out a very simplified value chain of emissions. Over the last 12 to 18 months, we've seen companies push significantly towards setting net zero targets and looking at how to now operationalise those targets more actively as they start to report performance against their emissions reduction commitments. I'll just talk to a few of these areas that we're really seeing a lot of focus. The data piece of this is really critical. What we're seeing, and I think particularly those that have experience in emissions reporting itself, is that there are significant challenges today on the way that we're measuring emissions performance, particularly for Scope 3 emissions. At the same time, trying to get more granular information around things like product footprinting really means that the companies that I'm working with are looking for ways to refine the way they measure and report on emissions today. And so making sure that we're helping our clients to target those most material emission sources and build out the way that they're measuring those emissions will then help to support better strategic decision making in really targeting the way that you're reducing your emissions. The next piece that I'll talk about is tax. So there are significant opportunities for companies to take advantage of tax incentives, grants and other government funds to support getting towards net zero. It's something that we're seeing not not yet frequently explored by a lot of the companies that we're working with. But I think tax is a very effective lever to help deliver on your decarbonisation goals and support more sustainable supply chains as well. So on the screen here, I have the way that we think about responding to the climate agenda at KPMG. We very much see it as an iterative process. It's not something that you can kind of do in one hit, get right and be done with it. It's something that we're all learning and developing as regulations change, as expectations change in the market, and having this iterative mindset really helps to continue to evolve the way that we're managing climate risk as a society. So where that starts with is identifying the relevant risks and opportunities for a business. That is both on the physical and what we call the transition risk side, those broader policy and social changes that will drive towards net zero. The next step is then assessing the impact of that risk. Where we're seeing a lot of our efforts today is helping companies to quantify the impacts of those risks and opportunities, and that supports that better, more thorough strategic and risk management decision making. The next is developing and implementing a response to material climate-related impacts. And the last at the centre is measuring and reporting on progress. This is at the heart of everything that we do, is tracking around sustainability and climate performance and helping to drive change through better data. So here I have a slide that really sets out what we see as the 4 benefits of having an integrated sustainability strategy. Enhanced reputation, revenue growth or risk mitigation, and cost reduction being the 4 elements of benefits that we're seeing on that integrated sustainability response today. Hopefully that has given you a brief overview of sustainability and climate and the key trends that we're seeing in the market today, and how we're helping companies to start to respond to those. Thanks very much to everyone. Looking forward to hearing more from the panel on this important topic.